There is a particular kind of audacity that I have encountered a handful of times in 40 years on this bench. Not the loud kind, not the arrogance of the man who points a gun, or the entitlement of the son who calls his father to make things disappear. This kind is quieter. It walks into a courtroom in a button-down shirt and speaks in measured tones and presents itself as having a legitimate grievance. And underneath all of that reasonableness is a claim so breathtaking in its nerve that you need a moment to absorb it fully before you can respond to it. The morning of March 3rd, I absorbed it slowly. The man making the claim was 53 years old. His name was Robert Finch. He was the biological father of a woman named Patricia Finch Moreau, who had died 4 months earlier at the age of 47. He had come to my courtroom to contest the distribution of her estate. He had not attended Patricia's high school graduation. He had not attended her college graduation. He had missed her 16th birthday and her 18th birthday and her 21st birthday and the years of birthdays between and after. He had not been at her wedding in 1999. He had not met his grandchildren, Patricia's 2 children, then aged 21 and 17, until they were old enough to understand why they did not know him and to have formed their own conclusions about it. He had spent the better part of 30 years in a state I can only describe as managed absence, present enough to maintain the technical designation of father, absent enough to have participated in almost none of what that designation means. His daughter had died of an aggressive cancer that had moved through her faster than her doctors had anticipated. She had been ill for 6 months. She had spent those 6 months at home with her husband and her children and her mother and the friends who had accumulated over a life well lived. She had died at 4:17 on a Tuesday morning in November. Robert Finch had not been at the hospital. He had, however, read the obituary. He had learned about the will, and he had decided on the basis of being her biological father that he was entitled to a share of the estate she had built without him. The estate was not enormous, a house with equity, the house Patricia and David had bought together 17 years ago, where they had raised their children, where she had tended a garden, and where, according to David, the flower beds were still exactly as she had planted them, and he could not bring himself to change them. A savings account, a life insurance policy, the total somewhere in the range of $300,000. Robert Finch was asking for $100,000 of it. That is what I was looking at on the morning of March 3rd, a man who had missed everything asking for a third of what everything had produced. The person contesting his claim was Patricia's husband, David Moreau. He was 51 years old. He taught high school history, American history, the same subject for 19 years, at the same school where 2 of his daughter's friends had been students and where he was, by any account I heard, a teacher that students remembered. He had been married to Patricia for 22 years. He had sat beside her through 6 months of treatment, through the diagnosis and the first round and the second opinion and the decision to stop treatment and the transition to hospice. He had been holding her hand when she died at 4:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, and he had called her mother before he called anyone else, because that is what Patricia would have wanted. He had with him an attorney, a calm, precise woman named Janet Hollins, who had done estate litigation for 20 years and who presented her case with the economy of someone who has learned that in matters like this, the facts are almost always sufficient if you present them clearly and let them breathe. David Moreau sat at the plaintiff's table, and he looked like what he was, a man who had buried his wife 4 months ago and had not yet found the far side of that, and who was now in a courtroom because the father, who had been absent for most of Patricia's life, had decided to be present for her death in the form of a legal claim. He was composed. He was there. He answered every question directly and without performance. The only sign of the cost of being in that room was his hands, flat on the table, entirely still, the deliberate stillness of a person who has learned to manage large things carefully and is doing so right now. Robert Finch had an attorney, too, a younger man named Craig Ellison, who was technically competent and whose fundamental argument was this: that in this jurisdiction, biological parents retain certain legal standing with respect to their children's estates under specific conditions, and that those conditions could arguably be said to apply here. He was not wrong about the law. The law in this area is genuinely complicated and not always aligned with what most reasonable people would consider just, and Ellison knew how to operate within that gap. He presented the argument clearly and without apology, which I respected even as I found the underlying claim difficult to absorb. I let both attorneys present their positions fully. I had questions for both of them, and then I asked to hear from David Moreau and from Robert Finch in their own words, because in my experience, the documents tell you what happened and the people tell you what it meant. He cleared his throat. He straightened in his chair. He said that his relationship with Patricia had been complicated, that they had gone through periods of distance and periods of attempted reconnection, that family relationships were rarely simple, that he had made mistakes, and he knew that, and he was not proud of it. I said, I appreciate that. I'd like something more specific. Can you tell me the last time you spoke with your daughter before her diagnosis? He said, we had spoken in the past few years. I said, can you give me a year? He said it had been a while. Maybe 3 or 4 years before the diagnosis. I said, so approximately 7 or 8 years ago. He said, thereabouts. I said, and before that? He said there had been a period of estrangement. He said these things happened in families. He said Patricia had been difficult to reach. I looked at Janet Hollins. She handed my clerk a document which was brought to the bench. It was a timeline. Patricia's husband had prepared it, or had helped prepare it, a chronological account of Robert Finch's presence and absence across the 47 years of his daughter's life. I read it. It took several minutes to read it properly. Not because it was long, it was 2 pages, because of what was in it, because of the specific, cumulative, undeniable weight of a life's worth of absences laid out in chronological order. Patricia's parents had divorced when she was 4 years old. Robert Finch had been awarded visitation every other weekend, alternating holidays, half the school breaks, the standard arrangement. In the first year, he had used roughly half of it. In the second year, less. By the third year, the document noted, the pattern had settled into what it described with the careful understatement of legal documentation as inconsistent. Birthdays. Her 6th, her 8th, her 10th, her 13th when she had started high school, her 16th, which her mother had celebrated with a dinner and a small cake and a card from a father who had sent nothing, her 18th, her 21st. The document listed them with the same neutral language throughout, and the neutrality made it worse, not better. Holidays, Christmas mornings that were supposed to alternate and did not alternate, school breaks when he was supposed to have her and did not appear, a summer vacation he had planned and canceled 3 weeks before it was supposed to start. The document did not editorialize, it simply recorded graduations. High school, 1993. He had told her he would be there. He had not been there. College, 1997. He had told her he would be there. He had RSVP'd to the family dinner her mother had organized for the evening. The document had a single line under the college graduation entry, added by David Moreau in a different font, which told me it had been added after the main document was prepared, added because he thought it needed to be in there. Patricia waited at the entrance for 45 minutes before going in without him. I read that line. I set the document down for a moment. Then I picked it up and read it again. 45 minutes. At the entrance of her college graduation, before she decided he was not coming and walked through the door herself. The document continued. Patricia's wedding in 1999. Robert Finch had been invited. He had RSVP'd, yes. He had not appeared. The explanation offered afterward was a work commitment. There was no follow-up card, no gift, no subsequent acknowledgement. Patricia's first child, a daughter, born in 2001. Robert Finch had been informed. He had not visited. Her second child, a son, born in 2004. Same. The grandchildren had met their grandfather twice, once at a brief, uncomfortable lunch when the older child was 7, once at a family event 4 years later when Robert had appeared unexpectedly and left after an hour. Patricia's diagnosis had been in the spring of 2 years before this hearing. David Moreau had informed Robert Finch by letter within the first month. The letter had been sent to the address on file, which turned out to be outdated. A second attempt had been made through Patricia's mother. Robert Finch had received the information. He had not called. He had not visited. Patricia had died 8 months after diagnosis. He had not been at the hospital. He had sent flowers after the funeral. The florist card said with deepest sympathy, no signature beyond his name. I set the document down. I looked at Robert Finch. I said, I've reviewed the timeline that has been submitted. I want to give you the opportunity to respond to it. Is there anything in it you dispute? He said, it's selective. It doesn't capture the full picture. I said, then help me understand the full picture. Tell me something that is not in this document, something that represents the relationship you had with your daughter. He was quiet. I said, take your time. I'm asking for one specific memory, one occasion, one moment where you were there. The courtroom was very still. He said, we had a good conversation once when she was in her 30s. She called me. We talked for a long time. She said she wanted to try to have a relationship. I said, and what came of that? He said, it didn't develop the way either of us hoped. I said, because of what? He said, circumstances, life, it's complicated. I said, Mr. Finch, your daughter called you and said she wanted to try to have a relationship. That is a significant thing for a person to do. It takes considerable courage to extend that kind of invitation to a parent who has been absent. What happened after she called? He said, we had a few more conversations. I said, and then? He said, it faded out. I said, it faded out. Your daughter called you, told you she wanted to try, and the result was that it faded out. He didn't answer. I turned to David Moreau. I asked him to tell me about Patricia. He looked at me for a moment. I think he had not been expecting that question in that form. Not the legal question, not the financial question, just that one. Tell me about her. He said, she was the most organized person I have ever known. She had a system for everything. The kids' school papers, the finances, the garden, everything had a place, and she knew where every place was. He paused. She used to say that if you took care of the small things, the big things took care of themselves. I said, what else? He said, she was funny. Not in an obvious way. She had this dry delivery that would catch you off guard. The kids inherited it. He stopped for a moment. She was a good mother. She was present in the way that some people just are. She showed up. That was the thing about Patricia. She showed up. He said that last sentence quietly. She showed up. I do not think he was directing it at Robert Finch intentionally, but it landed in the room the way things land when they are simply true. Robert Finch was looking at the table. I said, Mr. Moreau, during the 6 months of Patricia's illness, can you describe the last few weeks? He said, she was at home for most of it. She wanted to be home. We had people in, nurses at the end. Her mother was there almost every day. The kids were there constantly. She held on longer than the doctors expected, honestly. She was stubborn. He almost smiled. She wanted to make sure everyone was going to be okay before she let go. I said, was there anything she said about her father in those last weeks? He said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, she said she had made her peace with it a long time ago. She said she used to be angry about it when she was younger, and then at some point she just let it go. She said she didn't want to spend the time she had on anger that wasn't going to change anything. She said her life had been full, and that was what mattered. His voice had gotten quieter as he spoke. He looked at the table for a moment and then back up. He said, she didn't say his name. She just said she had made her peace. I looked at Robert Finch. He was still looking at the table. His attorney had a hand on the folder in front of him but was not moving. I said, Mr. Finch, your daughter spent her last weeks making sure her family was going to be all right. She spent them with her husband and her children and her mother. She spent them letting go of anger she had carried for a long time. And in those last weeks, according to her husband, she had made her peace with your absence. I paused. I said, I want you to understand what I am about to say and why I am saying it. I am not saying it to shame you. I am saying it because I think you may not have fully understood until you sat in this room today the specific nature of what you are asking for. I said you are asking for a share of the estate of a woman who waited for you at the entrance of her college graduation for 45 minutes before going in without you. A woman who called you in her 30s and said she wanted to try, and who received in return a few conversations and a fading out. A woman who was ill for 6 months and did not receive a single visit. A woman who, in the last weeks of her life, released the anger she had been carrying about your absence, not because you had asked her to, not because you had done anything to earn it, but because she was that kind of person, the kind who shows up, the kind who takes care of the small things, the kind who, even at the end, wanted everyone to be okay. I said, she took care of you too, Mr. Finch, not financially, not practically, but she let you go. She did not die angry at you. She made your peace for you because you never made it yourself. I said, and now you are here asking for $100,000. The courtroom was very still. I ruled against him. The legal arguments Ellison had made were competent, but not, I found, sufficient to override the clearly expressed wishes of a properly executed will in this jurisdiction. Patricia Finch Moreau had made her wishes explicit. The estate would pass as she had directed. Robert Finch and his attorney gathered their papers. It took a moment. No one moved quickly. Ellison organized his folder. Robert Finch sat for a moment with his hands on the table before he stood up, the way people sit when they are preparing for something they are not sure they are ready for. He stood. He put on his jacket. He did not look at David Moreau. He walked toward the door. Then he stopped. He stood at the door for a moment with his back to the room. Then he turned around. He looked at David Moreau across the length of the courtroom. David Moreau looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Robert Finch said, "She was a good person." His voice was quiet when he said it, not performed, not strategic. The voice of a man who had just spent an hour being forced to look at something clearly and was coming out the other side of it with only that simple, insufficient, entirely true statement. David Moreau looked at him. He said, "Yes, she was." Robert Finch nodded once, a single slow nod. Then he walked out of my courtroom and the door swung shut behind him. I watched the door close behind him and I sat with the silence for a moment. I thought about Patricia waiting at the entrance of her college graduation for 45 minutes. I thought about what that wait looks like from the inside, the checking of the phone, the watching of the crowd, the moment when you understand that he is not coming and you have to decide whether you are going to let that ruin the day or whether you are going to walk through the door. She walked through the door. She graduated. She built a life that by every account in front of me was full and good and real, and she did it without him, and she was not going to let him take a piece of it after the fact just because the law gave him a theoretical avenue to try. I thought about the phone call, the courage it takes to call a parent who has been absent and say, "I want to try," to make that offer knowing what the history is and making it anyway because you are the kind of person who believes that things can be different if people decide to make them different. She made that call, he received it, and then it faded out. I thought about what David said. She had made her peace. She didn't say his name. She just said she had made her peace. That is the sentence I keep coming back to. Not the legal ruling, not the timeline, not the 45 minutes at the entrance. That one sentence. She made her peace. Not because he had earned it, not because anything had been resolved or acknowledged or repaired, but because she was 47 years old and she was dying and she had decided that the anger was not going to have any more of the time she had left, that it had already taken enough, that she had better things to do with what remained. And she was right about that, because what remained was 6 months with her husband and her children and her mother and the friends who had been present for all of it. And she was going to spend every bit of it on them. She let him go. She did that for herself, I think, more than for him. But she did it. And it is the most generous thing in a story full of generous things. I have been on this bench for 40 years. I have seen people hold on to anger until it was the last thing they had, until it had outlasted everything else, until it was the only thing keeping them upright. And I have seen people much rarer who made the decision Patricia made, who looked at the weight they had been carrying and put it down not because everything was resolved, but because they were done giving it their energy. Who understood that release is not the same as forgiveness and is not the same as forgetting, but is simply the decision to stop letting someone who was never there continue to take up space in what is left. Patricia Finch Moreau was 47 years old. She showed up for everyone in her life. She showed up for her husband and her children and her mother and the friends who came to sit with her in the last weeks. She showed up in her own way, even for a father who had not shown up for her, by releasing what she carried, by not dying angry, by making a will that expressed clearly who she valued and trusted with what she had built. Her estate went to her husband and her children exactly as she had intended, exactly as she had written it down carefully and deliberately, because she was a person who took care of the small things so the big things were handled. That is the only ending this story was ever going to have. I hope Robert Finch drives home from this courthouse and thinks about 45 minutes, about what it takes to wait that long for someone and then walk through the door anyway, about the phone call she made, about the flowers that arrived after the funeral with no signature beyond a name. I hope he thinks about what she did with what was left of her time and understands fully what he did not do with all the time he had. Courts cannot make people understand things. I cannot order comprehension. I can only rule on what is in front of me and say, for the record, what I see. What I see is a woman who showed up her entire life and a man who arrived at the end expecting a share of what showing up had built. The answer was no. If this story reached something in you today, if it made you think about someone you have not shown up for, someone who may be waiting at an entrance somewhere right now, do not wait any longer. There is no version of this that gets better with more time. Subscribe to this channel because there are 40 years of mornings like this one, and I am not finished telling them. And leave me a comment. Tell me about someone who walked through the door without you and never made you feel it. Tell me their name. People like Patricia Finch Moreau deserve to be remembered for exactly who they were.